Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to session 2 of the technology strand. This is how a plant-based lifestyle, and meat alternatives in particular, contribute to the health of the planet and a smaller carbon footprint. Just to note, this session is being recorded right now. Our speakers for this session are Stefanie Dove and Kate Schaffner. Stefanie Dove works at Kelloggs and is working to help with plant-based lifestyles and meat alternatives. This session is now up to you two.
Okay, let's do a quick audio check. Can everyone hear me? I'll watch for a response in the chat. Oh, thanks everybody. Always good to check. We checked before, but if you can't hear me and then I don't know, then everything's just lost. Thanks guys, I got it. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining our session and wonderful to be here. Just like Jacob was saying, I'm Kate Schaffner. I sit on the global sustainability team for the Kellogg Company, the same company that makes cornflakes, Cocoa Pops, Pop-Tarts, Pringles, all these foods that we know and love. And my colleague, Stefanie Dove, is also joining us and is driving the slides. So thank you, Stefanie, and she'll speak more in a moment. As Jacob was saying, Stefanie leads our work around sharing more of our plant-based foods, particularly with some of our partners in schools and others. And she'll be speaking to some of the nutritional benefits of plant-based foods. And both of us will be talking a bit about the climate benefits of plant-based diets and how plant-based foods and lifestyles can be part of how we start to build a world that is more climate friendly, recognizing that climate change has material impacts on our world today, as this day it demonstrates at a minimum. So I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A as best I can, but if I miss any of your questions, please know that we'll come back and answer them at a later time. We'll try to hold 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions in case we miss any. Thank you for your patience. I'm an old millennial, and if I miss things, I promise we'll catch them later. So we can go ahead and move to the next slide. So I'm sure that this group is well aware of what greenhouse gases are and why they are important, but just to refresh our memories a little bit, we'll do a little bit of review of what greenhouse gases are, what has led to our current moment with respect to climate change, and some of the ways that all of us can address climate change, either from a greenhouse gas reduction perspective or from an adaptation perspective, and where plant-based foods can fit in that. So we'll start there, and then we'll switch over to talking about some of the nutritional benefits of plant-based foods. So, greenhouse gases, what are they? Our atmosphere includes several different kinds of gases. It includes carbon dioxide, oxygen, which we all know and love and rely on for survival, methane, nitrous oxide, and other gases. Greenhouse gases are called that because they absorb energy radiated from the Earth more than other gases, and that can contribute to an overall warming effect. Carbon dioxide, of course, has a global warming potential of 1. Global warming potential means how much that gas in the atmosphere can hold on to that energy. And other gases have even more global warming potential, methane being 1, nitrous oxide being another. And we'll flip to the next slide. And this is important because there are different sources of these greenhouse gases. Some of them are tied to natural processes that happen with or without us. Some of them are tied to human activity, and that's something that we can control, which is really important for building strategies for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to avoid the most serious impacts of climate change, particularly in the next 10 years, and to set ourselves up for a future where we can adapt to the changes around climate change that can't be avoided at this point. For example, methane is a greenhouse gas that is emitted from some agricultural practices that are necessary for us to grow the food that we all rely on to eat. Using livestock manure, for example, can be associated with methane emissions. Other emissions like carbon dioxide may be associated with natural processes like respiration or from burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, which is why the energy that we use, the fuels that we use are a really important part of how we build a more climate positive future. Carbon dioxide can also be released through deforestation. So for example, when we cut down forests to make room for cattle production, which is something that happens in Brazil, that can be associated with emissions, loss of carbon that would otherwise be stored in those trees for photosynthesis later. The same thing could be said of palm oil production in Southeast Asia. A lot of deforestation risk associated with palm oil production. Carbon dioxide can also result from other human activities, and that's been particularly serious since the Industrial Revolution, and it's contributed to a situation where we have an imbalance in the carbon cycle globally, meaning we are emitting more than is being absorbed back into natural processes. And as a result, the Earth is gaining energy as we reduce the amount of solar energy that is reflected out into space. So that is why we are where we are in this moment, where we have this global warming effect, and it's affecting the way that our ecosystems function and the way that our lives as humans can continue. Next slide. So where does Kellogg fit in all of this? Well, each of us has a responsibility to respond to the realities of climate change, particularly if you are a large business that sells food to people all over the world, that sources ingredients from all over the world, that manufactures all over the world. And we recognize that responsibility as a company and as a brand that many people recognize and therefore trust. And we want to make sure that we set a good example with respect to climate change, not just in how we talk about this publicly, but also in how we do our business. This started back in 2008 when we set our first greenhouse gas reduction targets for our manufacturing, so the plants where we make all of our food. And since then, we've developed a much broader strategy where we not only focus on reducing the emissions associated with how we make our food and our manufacturing facilities, but also across our supply chains. So if I take you through this chart, this represents our current strategy for how we are reducing the emissions associated with how we do business, how we manufacture our foods, and where the materials that we make our foods come from, as well as how we advocate for climate policy that is responsible and helps to drive greenhouse gas reductions generally. So starting over on the left-hand side of the screen, like I mentioned earlier, we are working to drive absolute reductions in greenhouse emissions. That means absolute change, not just a relative change per the amount of food that we produce. Through behavior change, through adoption of renewable energy technologies, through operations, and through how we invest in new facilities. That's what CapEx investments means, capital expenditure. And we've been doing that for the better part of a decade, and we've seen really positive results from that so far. We also disclose all of our greenhouse gas reductions publicly so that people can assess our progress and see how we're doing with that first part of our strategy. The next part of our strategy is in our supply chain. For all of the foods that we make, we have to buy packaging, ingredients, energy to run our plants, maybe help marketing our foods, those kinds of contracts. So all of those things that we purchase are part of our supply chain, and that's a really important piece of our overall carbon footprint. So we're working to reduce emissions with our suppliers as well. Our tier 1 suppliers, meaning the suppliers that we have a direct relationship those are the people that we make contracts with, saying, you're going to bring in this amount of corn grit to us every year to make cornflakes, that kind of relationship. We work directly with those kinds of suppliers to measure their greenhouse gas performance and report it. We were among the first food companies to start using a tool called CDP. That used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project. And that's a global survey platform that allows companies like us to work with our suppliers, to ask them questions about how they manage their greenhouse gas emissions and start to benchmark how they improve that over time. So it's a really important transparency tool and a tool for helping us to identify opportunities for improvement with our suppliers. And we do that with the vast majority of them, which has been very exciting and helpful. Next step in our strategy is ingredients, because for a food company of our scale, usually ingredients are a really big part of our overall greenhouse gas footprint. And like I was mentioning earlier, there are greenhouse gases that are usually specifically associated with agricultural practices, whether we're talking about using livestock manure as a fertilizer for growing crops, or deforestation to make fields available for more crops, or using more fertilizer than you need, because when that fertilizer, particularly synthetic fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers, hit the soil, they can volatilize very quickly. They can turn into a gas, and that gas is nitrous oxide, which has a really high global warming potential. So there are lots of opportunities to improve greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture for a number of different ingredients. So that's why we work with farmers in our ingredient supply chains to adopt technologies and strategies to reduce their emissions overall. And we have over 40 projects with farmers that do this all over the world. I could talk about that all day. So if anybody has questions about that at the end, I'm more than happy to go into that specifically. But for the sake of brevity now, that's a really big part of our strategy. There's a lot of opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ingredient production. And then lastly, because people know Kellogg and Kellogg's products, and because we have a responsibility to take action with respect to our own climate performance, we also have a responsibility to share that work externally and to work with industry groups and governments to advocate for policies that incentivize all of the work that we all need to do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we do that through industry groups like We Mean Business, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. These are groups that can then say to governments, we need policies that can help to innovate faster and make it easier to take on these technologies that reduce emissions fast. So that is our strategy writ large. You'll also see a couple logos over on the right-hand side. We can't do this work ourselves, as you could probably guess. There's a lot of work that we all need to do. So we turn to partners like GRI, SASB, the Sustainable Development Goals, which set global goals, not just for greenhouse gas reductions, but also human rights and supporting economic opportunity for smallholder farmers. It's very comprehensive to make sure that we're a part of a global community as well as a local community to make this impact together and to learn from one another, because we don't always have all the answers. So it's good for us to learn while we work. I know that's a lot. We have a big strategy around climate. So hopefully that was a helpful overview. And the last thing that I'll say on this before I move us on is that, this is a big piece of how Kellogg does our work, but I think it's also reflective of how manufacturers, particularly food manufacturers, act in this space now, because we all recognize that this kind of innovation is necessary for us to continue the lives that we all love and to build a world that will be climate resilient. So this is just an example of how it can look from an industry perspective. There are lots of other great examples too, and happy to talk about that bigger context with the group later. So I'll go ahead and move us to the next slide. And we can see it now. Wonderful. It was hiding from us before. PowerPoint can be a tricky tool, so I'm so glad that it can work. Thank you, Stefanie, for working your magic. So with all of that said, one last piece that is really important for how food manufacturers and how all of us can build a more climate positive future together is in how we eat. The kinds of technologies I was talking about earlier around adopting renewable energy in manufacturing, for example, tackling more climate positive transportation, fuel use overall, those kinds of big systemic infrastructure challenges are important for all of us, and they affect how we live our lives, but we don't all always have direct influence over those things. So what can we do, all of us, on a day-to-day basis to become a part of that more climate positive future? One of the things that we can do is to start to adopt plant-based diets. And that doesn't always mean that we're only eating plant-based foods, but it does mean finding ways to incorporate plant-based foods into more of our food choices, because generally speaking, plant-based foods can be lower in their greenhouse gas impact. And anything that each of us can do to reduce our overall impact can be part of a broader systemic reduction of that impact so that we start to hit a tipping point. And as has probably been said today, this is our decade of action, according to the UN and FAO, to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because if we don't do that in the next 10 years, we won't be able to escape the most serious impacts of climate change. So anything we can do is a part of making that change possible. So with that, this is a really important part of what we can start to explore as individuals and start to incorporate into our lives. But it's also been a part of how Kellogg does business since the very beginning. The business was first founded in 1906 by our founder, W.K. Kellogg, and he celebrated plant-based foods like cornflakes right from the beginning. That's carried through all the way to the products that we have now. About 86% of our recipes are entirely plant-based across the world. They're also really affordable and easy to incorporate into how we eat. Cereal is a really easy breakfast option. It's also pretty affordable, all things considered. So it's a straightforward thing that we can incorporate into our daily diets. And plant protein for us is a really important part of how we lead as food manufacturers. Morningstar Farms, which is one of our brands, is a leader in plant-based protein. And plant-based protein is important when talking about plant-based foods because humans need proteins to live and thrive and survive. So making sure that those plant-based diets incorporate that is essential. And that's where my expertise ends and where Stefanie Dove's begins. So maybe I can hand the mic over to Stefanie now. Does that sound okay? Oh, you're on mute.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kate. So yes, I'm Stefanie Dove. As Kate mentioned, I'm the Wellbeing and Regulatory Business Partner for Kellogg's, and I specialize in the K-12 arena. And so really what that means is I work with some of our other partners within Kellogg's, such as Kate, to help develop those stories that I can share with our students and teachers and educators about the foods that not only are we providing in your grocery stores, but also the foods that we're providing in your school nutrition program, so in your cafeterias at your schools. And to give you visibility and transparency to what we at Kellogg's are doing as a company. And one of the exciting things, I'm a science person, being a dietitian, food science is the core. If you told me that I would be taking organic chemistry, microbiology, all of these other science classes, I was like, I just wanted to be a dietitian because I love food. I would have never envisioned that, but it's been so fascinating. And with a large food company such as Kellogg's, I'm interacting and Kate interacts with these our colleagues on a regular basis. We have food scientists, we have engineers on staff for not only our plants, but then engineers and R&D experts and packaging. We have a sustainable packaging team and an agile team. And so there's a lot, and I say this because there's a lot of different career opportunities available in food companies that you may have never considered. So it's a shameless plug. I always encourage students to explore the possibilities. There's a lot out there. And as we've been talking about sustainability and climate change, we at Kellogg's and a lot of food companies, we know it's important for us to really lead the way in being part of a more sustainable future. And so when we're looking at things such as plant-based protein alternatives, in some cases, they generate 10 times fewer greenhouse gas emissions than producing a similar beef-based product, such as when you're comparing a plant-based burger to a traditional beef burger. That being said, it's also important to note that, as Kate mentioned, we talk about more of a plant-based or plant-forward diet. With that, that also means that it's okay to still eat meat-based items as well. A plant-forward diet just means that you're being more intentional about putting more plants on your plate. So there's always a room. We always talk about, and the well-being side of things, that there's a room at the table for every food, but looking at the impact that your food choices have, not only on your nutrition, but also the environment, is an important part. And so that's why we are really excited to have all of this commitment to plant-based protein options here at Kellogg's for that reason, because we understand that there is a need to really be more mindful and incorporate sustainable foods so that we can minimize our carbon footprint. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some plant-based meals and trends. I love data and statistics, so I pulled some that I just think are so exciting to see. And so a recent survey surveyed consumers to ask what occasions they most consume plant-based proteins. And so dinner was the most common meal occasion, followed by lunch, snacks, and then breakfast. And desserts and other were obviously the lower amount. And so what that means is if you look at, I'd love to know, and so I'd love for you guys to engage in the chat box. So for those of you who consume plant-based proteins in your day, what meal occasion are you consuming more plant-based proteins? Are you consuming them at lunch because your school cafeteria has them on the menu? Or are you at dinner because your family tries to do meatless Mondays or a meat-free day for dinner one time during the week? I'd love to hear from you. And if you have a plant-based dessert, I'm very curious to know what plant-based desserts you guys enjoy. And I was actually surprised to see breakfast at the lowest. When we first got these reports, I just naturally assumed that might be an opportunity in a meal occasion that would be higher. But the data is the real data. So I love to see, and I can't see the chat box. Kate, did anyone comment in there?
Yes, we're seeing lots of lunch and dinner. A couple people are making these meals for themselves. So well done to those who are making these things themselves. One person is the only vegetarian in their home. So it's an important part of how they make sure they stay fed. Maybe I'm seeing one breakfast and dinner. I see one person saying they can't give up their meats, but normally lunch when at school. Fair enough.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because how many of you have heard about the term flexitarian? So we've heard someone even identified in the chat that they're the only vegetarian in their home, or they may be a vegan in their home. And what we're seeing is a big push for the flexitarian mindset. And really what that is these are consumers, and you'll see that 86%, based off of this recent study, confirm that they do not consider themselves neither a vegan nor a vegetarian. They just are more intentional about incorporating more plant-based proteins into their assortment. And so for that person who says that they cannot give up meat on their menu, that is really what a plant-forward meal pattern is all about. And that is really what this flexitarian mindset is about. It's not about giving up. It's about saying, so if I'm making chili and that's what we're having for dinner, is there a way to, instead of making it an all animal protein chili, could you reduce the amount of animal protein in half and then add the other half with a plant-based protein crumble that would be kind of like a ground beef alternative in there? In doing so, you're still getting that meat in there that you love and desire, but you're also putting more sustainable food choices in there, but still getting those proteins that are essential. And that is really what the flexitarian mindset is about. So it's not about totally eliminating everything. It's really just being more intentional and just eating more plants. And that is really where it comes from. And you'll see that some stats, about half of the population identify as being a flexitarian, and they're more likely to be females of the millennial and Gen Z demographic. And so all of the students on here, you guys fall within the Gen Z demographic, in case you were not aware of this. And of this study, 30% of the millennials reported that they eat meat alternatives every day. And the number of vegetarians and flexitarians is predicted to increase by 24% and over the next 10 years, which is about 41 million people. And so just those small lifestyle changes can make a significant impact on that. And you'll see that a recent study was looking at the importance of a complete plant-based protein. And so about 67% said they're consuming a complete plant-based protein is important to them, and 2 in 10 believe it's very important to them. That being said, kind of like the stats before, it's not surprising that those who eat the most plant-based meals tend to be females or the younger consumers. So your younger millennials or your Gen Z populations. And those are the ones who are saying it's most likely that they view consuming plant-based proteins as very important. And one of the reasons why some prefer to really incorporate more plant-based proteins is because soybeans specifically are what we call a complete protein. And so a protein is made up of 20 amino acids. And of those 20, our bodies naturally produce 11 of those. So that leaves 9 amino acids that, if you have ever seen the term contains essential amino acids, they're essential because our bodies do not produce those naturally. And soybeans actually contain all 9 of those essential amino acids. However, other items, which in the dietary world we would call complementary proteins, I like to use rice and beans as a perfect example. The complementary proteins may have some, but not all of the amino acids. So the amino acids that are found in like brown rice are different from those that are found in the beans. So when you pair those 2 items together, you will then get your complete protein assortment with all of your amino acids. However, something like a plant-based burger or a plant-based meal that contains soy, you will be getting all of those complete proteins. And so that is why there's this conversation of complete proteins is a little confusing, especially if you're not haven't followed it a lot. And so that's why the average consumer is somewhat confused by what that means and why something like a soy-based alternative can help them achieve their complete protein needs. And you'll see that, as Kate had already mentioned, at Kellogg's, we're really looking to see what we can do within our supply chain to help minimize the carbon footprint. And you'll see that we're comparing the carbon footprint to a variety of protein soy sources on there. So you have isolated soy protein, you have your whey protein concentrate, then you have things such as poultry and pork on there, and beef. And so you'll see that isolated soy protein, which is an ingredient that is in quite a bit of plant-based soy alternatives, has the lowest carbon footprint compared to some of your animal-based protein sources. And so when we're talking about sustainability and the impact that your food choices can have on the environment and climate change, this is why we like to bring that up. That being said, once again, we know that all foods fit. It's just that you can see how mixing and matching your protein sources can help truly have an impact on the environment. And so why plant-based protein? Kate and I both talked about this. They are better for the planet. It also makes adding it to the menu quite easy. And so just swapping out one meat-based meal for a plant-based meal for a week for the entire year could actually help you save 1,000 square feet of land, 184 carbon miles of greenhouse gas emissions, and 200 showers worth of water. And we know that our students are really concerned about the social responsibility and what the food companies that they believe in and that they consume at home, what they're doing to stand behind this. And so some of you may also be asking, well, how did you come up with this? Like, where did you get your stats from? And so one thing that we are excited about is we developed our plant power calculator last year, and we worked with scientists and data experts to generate examples of what swapping out plant-based meals could do for the environment, based off of meal occasion. And so we have it broken out by breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And we have it so it shows what students, because we know that students really want to know what their impact could be, and by the number of weeks. And so on the next slide, I gave you an example of what I generated in our calculator. And so if 400 students made the decision to swap out a traditional burger at lunch for a plant-based burger at lunch for 1 year each week, this is the impact that that group of students could have on the environment. And I love that our calculator gives you things that would be under, I'm a visual person, and so for those of you who are, so an example of the impact is that this impact is more than 22 trips all the way across Texas. So we all know Texas is a very large state. So imagine going back and forth 22 times. That's the impact for emissions that in greenhouse gases, that just swapping that out and having a collective group of students swap that out could have. And so this tool is available that you guys can plug and play. And for those of you who were mentioning in the comments about your families and trying to get them kind of on board to incorporate more plant-based, this is a great tool to just show, hey, if we could try this like even once a week for every month, not even every week, here's the impact as a family we could have on the environment. And so you can put in your own data, or if you and your friends at your school, you can even figure out at your school. So I know all of you are coming from different homeschools. So if you know the total enrollment in your school, you could plug those numbers in and just say, wow, if we all like committed to a meatless Monday, one week out of the year, this is the impact our school could have on the environment. So I encourage you to play with some of those stats. And yeah, if you love data, I encourage you guys to really play with that. And Kate, with that, I believe we wanted to allow ample time for questions for students. So if you have not put any questions in the chat box, please do. And Kate and I will get to those questions.
Yes, and we did have one question come in. I will answer as best I can. It's not as immediately relevant for Kellogg products because it's asking about fish, but I will pull on my past experience with the World Wildlife Fund and my training there to give a preliminary answer. And others are welcome to add in other questions as they come through. So the question was, I realized how different types of meat have different carbon footprints. Oh, good. I'm glad this isn't the first time someone has seen this. How is fish's carbon footprint compared to others? Can being pescatarian also help improve our carbon footprint? So I'm going to answer the way lots of sustainability professionals answer, and I hope that you won't get frustrated. It depends. Partly because fish products can be produced in lots of different ways. The first difference that comes to mind is whether the fish was wild caught, as in out in an ocean, in a freshwater lake, in a river, things like this, versus if it was farmed. So if it was in some sort of aquaculture system that's land-based, usually. And the one reason why the carbon footprints of those two systems may be different is that the fish's diet is different. If you're eating a fish product that was produced through aquaculture, it's usually raised on an aquaculture feed diet, and sometimes that can include plant-based ingredients like soy. And one of the reasons that the carbon and water footprints of beef, for example, can be quite large is that those animals are usually raised on diets with lots of row crops, so corn, soy, others. And they have their own embedded carbon and water footprints. And that just becomes part of that beef product's overall footprint. The same could be said of fish products that are made with aquaculture processes. It doesn't mean that all aquaculture produced fish is not sustainable. It can be one way to provide healthy fish products while avoiding overfishing of really pressured fisheries, particularly in marine systems. That's an important issue to take in mind from a biodiversity perspective. If we overfish, then we risk having that fishery collapse, which has implications for that ecosystem, but it also has implications for our economies, right? Particularly for fishers and anglers. So that's really complicated. I know that's the thing about agriculture and food. There are so many complicated network questions and interrelated impacts that sometimes it can be hard to boil it down to, so what do I do now? I'm in the grocery store. How do I make these choices? And one tool that is worth considering when you're buying fish products is to look for products that have been certified by the Marine Stewardship Council or the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. And those are two certifications, one for marine fish products and one for aquaculture fish products, just to help give a sense of whether those products were produced in a way that is sustainable and follows clear criteria. So I offer that as one tool for the next time you're in the grocery store. To the best of my knowledge, Kellogg does not produce any products with fish-based ingredients. So that's a little off the cuff from me, but I hope that that helps to start to answer the question. I also see another question. Does Morningstar plan on eliminating GMOs and such anytime soon? And Stefanie, if you have an answer on this, I'm happy to yield the floor. Otherwise, I can speak to it from a general Kellogg position on GMOs.
I will let you take
Sure.
that one. Yep.
Cool. So we talk about our position on GMOs on our website, and I'm happy to share the link for that with Tim in case anybody's curious later. We do use labeling schemes to share when ingredients that were produced from genetically engineered crops appear in our foods. To the best of my knowledge, there is no public goal for Morningstar Farms to reduce ingredients that were made from genetically engineered crops. I will say that the topic of genetically engineered crops, which typically we talk about as GMOs, if we're just like in the grocery store and looking for what we're going to buy for dinner, is complex. There are concerns around how those crops can affect the livelihoods of farmers. There are concerns around the environmental impact of those crops. And there was actually a quite comprehensive meta-analysis that came out, gosh, I want to say in 2015. I'll find the link for that and send it to Tim as well, in case anybody wants that too, that did a really comprehensive assessment of the peer-reviewed research of the food safety implications of genetically engineered ingredients, as well as other implications from an environmental perspective, and found that there had not been food safety risks associated with those ingredients. It's perfectly understandable if you personally don't want to purchase or eat foods that were made from those ingredients. All of the peer-reviewed science available to us indicates that it does not pose any harm risk to us. So that is part of why they are a part of our foods today. I'm going to pause. Stefanie, am I missing anything? Do you hear any gaps?
No, you answered that perfectly. Yeah, there's that is what the brand is behind for Morningstar. So
correct. Great. And like I mentioned, I had 2 links that I was going to send to Tim. So if anybody wants to follow up with that, please know that he'll have those resources after today, just in case you're curious to delve in more. And Tim, thank you in advance for receiving those links. I know we hadn't talked about that. I just want to make sure that I give a complete answer.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm seeing questions come in through the chat. I'm going to close the Q&A for a second. Let's see. Are there any specific methods or technologies accompanying ingredient production that are specifically sustainable that Kellogg's employs that other companies should also invest in or employ? So with regard to ingredient production, I can talk about this from the perspective of agriculture. There's more to producing ingredients, of course. There's, once you get a crop off the field, you need to mill it, for example. If you want flour to go into crackers, you start with wheat grain and then you mill it down into a flour. And there are plenty of opportunities from a manufacturing perspective to make that more sustainable. You can use renewable energy in your plants. You can reduce your water use in your plants, things like this. From an agriculture perspective, I think there are several things that can be done that are across the board more sustainable, and that we are not the only food company to support. A lot of our peers are doing this too, but we try to invest in things like only using fertilizer when you need it, if you are a farmer, because you are not only providing essential nutrients to your plants so they can grow and produce the crops that will become our ingredients, but you're also creating an opportunity for more greenhouse gas emissions. Like I mentioned earlier, when those fertilizers are applied, they can volatilize, which means they turn into a gas quite quickly. And when they volatilize, especially nitrogen-based fertilizers, they can turn into nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas with a high global warming potential. So if you can optimize how you fertilize your crops, it means that you're only using the fertilizer that you need for those crops, and you're reducing the possibility of over-applying that fertilizer and therefore contributing to more greenhouse gas emissions than is needed. There's also opportunity to look at it from a soil health perspective, because the reason you're putting that fertilizer into your soil in the first place is you want to make sure that those nutrients are available to crops. If you're managing your soil so that they already have a lot of the nutrients that your crops need, so you're using cover crops in between your crops that help to put some of that nitrogen and carbon back into the soil that you took out when you grew those crops. That's a really great practice that we support with farmers all over the Midwest and outside of the US as well. I would also say that anything you can do to prevent soil erosion, which would mean that you're losing sediment and nutrients from your soil anytime you have a rain event. So the rain falls, water flows off the surface of the soil and takes soil and nutrients with it. Anything you can do to avoid that is really useful. So minimizing how much you're tilling the soil so that the soil is more stable. Again, using cover crops so that you have a crop in place to hold all that soil in place is very helpful. Those are the kinds of practices that pretty much across the board are useful if you're talking about annual crops. And they're a really big part of how we work with farmers through our Kellogg's Origins program. When I mentioned earlier that we have 40 projects, 40 plus, all over the world, those are our Kellogg's Origins projects where we invest in working with farmers to help them adopt some of these practices. They're really positive practices, and sometimes farmers need a little bit of extra training or support to integrate them into how they farm. So that's what we do with farmers and with our ingredient suppliers. And like I said, we're not the only food company doing this, but we do what we can to lead and to make sure that our programs are as impactful and high quality as they can be. And so that we're celebrating farmers too, because ultimately they're the ones that are adopting these new practices. They are, the very beginning of innovation and technology and science with how we do our business. So they deserve a lot of that credit and celebration. Thanks for bearing with me as I got on my soapbox about how amazing farmers are. I also see this question: if our family is poorer class, then how can I go to Flexitarian? Stephanie, would you like to start us off on that? I can if you would like. Let me know what you want to do.
Yeah, I think for Flexitarian, I think that there is an opportunity to incorporate more plant-based foods, regardless of one socioeconomic status. The lovely thing about plants are that, as Kate mentioned earlier in some of her initial slides, some plant-based foods are actually more economical and affordable than other meat-based foods. And so I think that it's really incorporating it, and you can do so by still continuing to consume those things that your family has been consuming within their budgets. But then you could make a choice perhaps that maybe on a menu assortment. So I go back to, I use rice and beans a lot as an example. That may be a menu opportunity where you could incorporate some plant-based proteins, because traditionally rice and beans are two affordable items and ingredients that are in a lot of dishes. That's why they're staples in a lot of cultures and a lot of regions. And so you can incorporate some things in there and really add a little bit, and you can incorporate some of these things without really surpassing your food budgets that you guys have as a constraint.
Thanks, Stephanie. And I think I see a thank you in the Q&A. Thanks, everybody. I see a question in the Q&A about lab-grown meat, so I can tackle that one. The question is, would you say that the benefits of plant-based diets outweigh the benefits of lab-grown meat? Is it too early for lab-grown meat to know for sure? And I think that second part of the question is going to be integrated into my answer. So for anyone who isn't familiar, there's been a lot of innovation in the last 5 years, I would say, in what some people are calling lab-grown meat, what some people are growing cellular meat or clean meat. That last one is probably my least favorite, because I think it unnecessarily maligns other ways of growing animal-based products, when really we're all just trying to build a more climate positive future. But all of that said, those titles, sorry, that was my opinion, noted as my opinion and not as fact. We'll get back to fact. So those are some of the titles and claims that you might hear for some of those products. It's really early in their development, and while there have been a few life cycle assessments to identify what the water and climate impacts of those products may be, it's still a little bit early to know exactly what those footprints will look like and how they might vary depending on what kind of technology you're using to grow lab-grown meat, and whether that facility is using renewable energy and how they're managing their water use and all of those pieces. So I guess the answer I would give is that we are still watching how these products evolve, so that we can make sure that we're using sound science and robust data to really understand what the impact of that may be. So at this point, I would not say that one outweighs the other, but that one is certainly more available than the other in supermarkets now. So noting that and thinking about what we can do now to hopefully reduce our individual footprints, that plant-based options are certainly available and can be an easy thing to incorporate into what we do. I appreciate the question, and I will be curious to see how those products evolve and how the communication about their impact continues to change as more data are available, as more life cycle assessments are done, so that we can better understand what our options are as consumers. I hope that helps. And again, I will try to be explicit about when I am sharing an opinion and not share an opinion if it's not helpful. We'll focus on facts for today. Thank you, Jaden. Okay, we've got one more question in the Q&A. Shopping local and smaller businesses is often advocated in the climate change circle. How does a large company like Kellogg address these recommendations? I would say that all of these practices need to be part of how we make our decisions as consumers. I don't think it needs to be one or the other necessarily. And there have been some studies looking at the carbon impact of purchasing locally, which varies a lot depending on where you are, seasonality, how you actually travel to where you purchase your local products is a big piece of it too. So there are a lot of variables to it. What I would say is that all of these solutions need to be on the table for us as individual consumers for how we make these choices. So at no point will we say, Stephanie and I, don't shop local, just buy these prepackaged products, right? But by the same coin, I do think that there's some value in having products that are easy for us to make a part of our lives and that are produced by companies that have a big footprint, but also have a lot of influence because of that footprint to reduce their climate impact. So that's that's why I think that products like Kellogg's should be a part of the conversation. Ultimately, you get to decide as individual consumers what you purchase. So that can guide how you manage those decisions. Short answer, I think all of those solutions need to be on the table. It's not a one or the other discussion. I hope that helps. That was from an anonymous question. So thank you to the student who posed that question. Sorry, I can't name you.
And Kate, I would just jump in and say, much like we were talking about the food, just it's all about those small choices and decisions that can equal a bigger impact. So even if you favor a local farmers market and you just love getting your local produce there, those decisions still contribute to, you know, climate change in some capacity. And so just like that person who asked the question about incorporating more flexitarian lifestyles when you have financial constraints, sometimes that same concern comes up with the push for shopping local. And so it's really doing what you can to make a positive impact, and your food choices are one of those ways that you could do that, but all foods fit in the grand scheme of things.
Agreed. And we have about 5 minutes left, which should be just enough time for one more question in the Q&A. So the question reads, how does Kellogg's address green packaging and reducing plastics in product delivery? And I can tackle this one. So Kellogg has a 2025 goal to transition 100% of our packaging to compostable, reusable, or recyclable. And we are well on our way to doing that. We disclose our progress every year to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. They're a large global organization that is championing more sustainable packaging choices across the industry. So we share all of our data with them, and we share it in our global reporting for corporate responsibility. So that includes using recycled content. It includes innovations in our packaging so that packaging materials that were not recyclable before are recyclable now. I think it was in 2019, maybe early 2020. Apologies, COVID-19 has changed my sense of time. But in the last year and a half, Bare Naked actually announced that they were switching their packs for their granola products to be recycle ready, so that all you would have to do as a consumer in the US is take that empty package once you were done enjoying your delicious granola back to the store, and that they would take care of that recycling as well. So we continue to share the innovations and the successes that we've had in switching that over, as well as reporting on all of the packaging materials that we use in our products and our progress toward our 2025 commitment to switch to, again, compostable, reusable, recyclable. Thank you for that question, Denise. Okay. We have a few minutes left. I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A or in the comments. And I'm pausing in case anybody has a late breaking question. Okay. Well, if we have a few minutes, I think it might be okay for us to end a little bit early if we finished our discussion. Thank you. I'm seeing some thank yous in the comments. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your attention. Thank you, Stefanie, for walking us through a lot of this. And really appreciate everyone making time to talk about some of these innovations and how we make our foods and where our foods come from and how that can be part of what we can do as individuals to make a more climate positive future.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions that you just didn't feel comfortable putting in the chat box, I'm sure if you let your instructors know those questions, Kate and I would be happy to answer those questions for you and direct you to some of those sources.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, well, thank you both for speaking. That I think we can close out session 2. We're going to take half an hour for lunch, and session 3 will begin at 1 o'clock.